My name is Sarah Davis, and I'm the educator at the Illinois State Museum. So thank you for joining us for Tales from the Vault, Fossil Finds in Midwestern Cave. And just so without further ado, I will turn it over to Illinois State Museum Geology Curator, Melissa Pardi.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you everyone for joining me today during what for many of you is probably your lunch hour. And without further ado, I'm going to be talking about fossil finds in Midwestern caves at the Illinois State Museum. So first, to orient us, I'm actually not from the Midwest. I'm not from Illinois. I'm a relatively new resident here. So when thinking about the Midwest, I just wanted to make sure that I am talking about the Midwest. And so I'm showing a map here of where people who consider themselves to be Midwesterners agree that the Midwest is. And I've circled the states here where most of the cave material that I'm going to be talking about today actually comes from. Does include Illinois, but actually a majority of the material we have, it turns out, is from Missouri. We do also have some material from Kentucky and Minnesota that will come up in this talk occasionally. So the reason that we have material from a broad number of places, there's a bunch of different factors related to that. We are interested in what's going on in Illinois, but animals don't particularly care about geopolitical boundaries. And so having a broader collection actually sometimes helps us put the fossils into a better context. So why does the Illinois State Museum have an interest in caves, just in a general sense? Well, it turns out that caves are actually very valuable. Studying caves is really important for considering things like water resources, mineral and geological resources. They also hold record of past climate. There are people that study the structures that develop in caves called speleothems, and they lock in information about the climate over time as the minerals precipitate in the caves. They tend to also be places where you can find information of archaeological material, biological material. People like to go into caves. So protecting them just from an economic and recreational standpoint is really important. And then, of course, for the purposes of this talk, caves are great places to find fossils, it turns out. So what is cave paleontology? We can think about it a couple of different ways. The first way is actually the rock itself. Many caves form in what are known as limestones, or more broadly carbonate type of rocks. And these are rocks that dissolve really easily, and then you get these void spaces that open up. And if you actually look at the rocks themselves in caves, you'll sometimes find the ancient remains and fossils of the marine organisms that form in that rock. This talk, however, is not going to be about these marine invertebrates, but about the vertebrates that we actually find in the sediments that are within caves. And so I've got a really entertaining picture here from a Living Museum article from 2001, showing a cave paleontologist doing his work. He's in a tight space, working in sort of these claustrophobic conditions that you sometimes find yourself in a cave. So why are we interested in caves, and why do we find caves to be such good places to find fossils? Well, here at the museum in the Research and Collections Center, we like to keep all of our collections in really stable conditions, low light, very low temperature and humidity fluctuations. And you get a similar situation in caves. The further into a cave you get, the less light you have, the less fluctuation, and then you do get these very stable conditions in these very dark caves where we don't get sunlight and the temperature is pretty constant. Caves are also really great for finding fossils because they tend to be areas of deposition. And so I'm showing this, mock-up cartoon here of a mountain that has a cave underneath it. And a mountainous area is not typically where you would find a lot of fossils. So you have weathering and things being moved away from that environment, and that is not an ideal condition for preserving fossilized remains. However, when you have void spaces such as caves, you can have those sediments actually weathering into the caves and being deposited within the caves themselves. And sometimes these caves will have little openings that kind of open up to the surface, and then you have a pit situation where then debris and material can then fall in further inside the cave as well. So you can actually have multiple places within a cave where you're getting net deposition. Caves are also things that animals use. Animals go inside of caves for all kinds of reasons. They may actually physically live in the cave for extended periods of time. So you think of things like bats, many bats live in caves. Things like bears like to hibernate in caves, and they spend a lot of time in there. You also get animals that use caves intermittently. So they may use it as a temporary shelter, or as a place to raise young, or as a safe location to consume food. And if they're consuming food and bringing, food items into the cave to consume them, or in the case of like a small carnivore or a predatory bird like an owl, they may spend some time in the cave and actually regurgitate or defecate some of the materials of the past meals that they've had. And those are some ways that other bones can end up in caves. So what is the process of doing cave paleontology? We actually find, we get tips from cavers themselves sometimes of, which caves might be kind of good to check out for potential for there being fossils present. So if you're a caver and you come across some bones, definitely let a paleontologist know. We'd be really interested in hearing that. We typically would then go into the cave and do a test pit. And then if we do find that there actually is fossiliferous material or a large abundance of fossil material, we might then open this up into a larger excavation. And so that basically involves, as I noted in a previous slide, kind of working in these dark, cramped conditions, physically removing the sediments from the cave themselves. So if there's any large bones, we might remove those individually, but it turns out that there's going to be other fossils in there that we're going to want to recover, that we're not going to be able to see until we actually physically remove the sediments. And so I'm sharing some embarrassing field pictures of me from a number of years ago. We take these sediments and we put them into screens and we run water through them to actually get rid of the fine material. And then we're left with larger rocks, but also frequently bone fragments. And then as we're processing them, we pull the bones out. We don't want to have delicate things like skulls and jaws, which are very valuable, getting destroyed with us messing around with it too much. And then we often will take the dried material to a separate location to meticulously pick out every last bit of bone from what's this high graded screen wash that we get from caves. And this often leads to being able to recover an incredibly rich record. And so you end up with, this is material that's been fully processed. It's in one of the drawers in the range here. And so each of these little baggies, each of these little boxes, each of these little tiny vials have the fossil remains of living things from the past. And they can take up quite a bit of space. So a little bit more about the ISM's collection. Our museum has what I would consider to be kind of a uniquely extensive collection relating to caves. So within our physical collections, we have paleontological material from at least 73 Midwestern caves, which occupy a substantial portion of the collection. There's 18 cases being shown here, and each of these has little shelves, and they're all full of fossils. In addition to the actual fossil materials we have from caves, we have sort of in the past had a more broader interest in caves in general, especially following the Illinois Cave Protection Act of 1985. ISM actually received money from the state to do an inventory to establish baseline information on caves throughout the state. And we are also the repository of the information pertaining to those caves. Based on those surveys, we know that there are well over 400 caves that were identified in Illinois during the survey. Of course, not all of these have fossils. So actually, a lot of our fossil collection comes from caves that are in the very most southern part of the state of Illinois, but then also from Missouri. And so this is a region called the Ozark Plateau. So this area that I've highlighted here on this map. This map is showing in the green areas what are called karst deposits. And so these are deposits where you tend to find caves showing up quite a bit. The results of the cave survey in Illinois also indicate that in the very northern part of the state, a region called the driftless area does actually probably have the potential for vertebrate fossil remains, but the majority of this talk is going to be on the Ozarks and Missouri and southern Illinois. And so this is going to basically be a tour of what are predominantly research collections. So these are going to be things, since this is Tales from the Vault, these are going to be typically things that you are unlikely to see on exhibit. These are important specimens, however, they may not be the prettiest of specimens. But nonetheless, this is a sneak peek kind of at like what we have locked away in our collections. So the other thing you need to know about caves and the fossils that they contain is that they're mostly from a time period called the Quaternary. And so these sediments are going to be less than 2 million years old. And the reason for that is that erosional processes have the tendency to be destructive to caves. So as the landscape erodes, those caves are getting eroded off the surface as well. The last 2 million years have been climatically very dynamic. So if you're not aware, this is the time period where we have repeated glacial, interglacial cycles. So periods of time where specifically in North America, we had large ice sheets that covered the landscape. And so we have these fluctuating climates, fluctuating environments. And what's great about these cave deposits is that they actually capture a lot of what's going on in the environment, at least ecologically, based on the fossils that are present. So the first bit here is going to be talking about evidence of change, and I'm introducing a term here called extralimital. So this is species that were here in the past but are now found somewhere else. So they're outside, we're finding them outside of where we currently find these animals. So these are animals that are still alive. And so there are some interesting examples of things that were once present in the Midwest. So for example, we have evidence of moose. So this is not an animal that you typically find in sort of the southern middle part of the Midwest. This is a bit of a scapula, so part of a shoulder blade that was found in a cave in Boone County in Missouri. We also have in our records, apparently we have some remains of reindeer or caribou, and that's another high latitude large herbivore that was evidently present here during the late Quaternary. We also have evidence that pronghorn was present in Missouri, again in Boone County. So pronghorn, these are Antelope capra americana, which means American goat antelope. However, it's neither of these things. It is neither an antelope nor a goat. This is a unique animal that evolved in North America, and the species that is still alive today is the only living species of what was once a diverse family of these animals that are what is considered endemic or from North America. We get we have this specimen here of a porcupine. So again, evidence that this animal was here. We found it in multiple counties in caves throughout Missouri. Those are listed here. And I have the geographic range of the current distribution of porcupines. And so you can see we don't quite get them in Illinois or Missouri presently, but they were evidently here in the past. Another animal that is still currently alive that we don't have presently is this eastern species, the hairy-tailed mole. And this is an animal that likes forested and open environments that have kind of loose, dry soil. So they have this ability to dig. And you can really see from the physical characters of this animal. I've got a study skin from our zoology collection shown here. And you can see these digging adapted front limbs. And this bone that I'm highlighting here from the actual physical fossils from the cave These are actually humerized, so this is your upper arm bone, and these are just really bizarre looking in digging animals. They're really diagnostic, so they have these sort of flanges on them or muscle attachments that really enable this animal to dig. Another animal that was present here in the past that we do not have currently are Redbacked Fools. And so this was found in numerous locations in Missouri. This is an animal that we typically think of as being more high latitude. We also find it out in the West at higher elevations. And here's a study skin and a skull from our comparative collection in zoology. Another northern species, the taiga vole, so getting even further north, this suggests that the environments were really different in the Midwest in the past. I'm showing reference collections here because the material actually from the caves on these specific species were so broken up and tiny that it would have been impractical to actually show them to you. However, I did get a couple of pictures from a couple of different animals. So we actually get collared lemmings down in the Midwest during the last ice age. And so this is a specimen from Taney County in Missouri. I was able to pick out a tooth that looked pretty promising and put it under a microscope and took a photograph for you. And so this is part of a tooth. So this would be the stuff that we're looking at as paleontologists trying to make identifications on species. And you can see the scale bar there, that's 1 millimeter. And so we're looking for specific special diagnostic characteristics that tell us that this is this animal. And so this is, again, I'm showing a complete skull that we have of Dicrostonyx from our comparative collections. And so what I literally would do if I was working on this material would be having both under a microscope and looking for those diagnostic characters. Another one that I was able to get a picture of for you is the Western Heatherville. So again, a small mammal that was present here in the past that is now found fairly out west in mountainous environments. We get animals as well that are more diagnostic or characteristic of what we think of as kind of Western environments. So this is an example of a grasshopper moose. And so finding all of these small mammals that we currently find them in very different places, from the montane West to tundra and Arctic environments, and also out east, tells us that animal responses to change are potentially very complex. So all of these animals were present here at some point in the past, and it was cooler during parts of the last glacial maximum, and it got warmer. However, what this tells us is that animals don't just move north when those glaciers receded. Some of them moved north, some of them moved out west, and even some of them shifted their ranges east. And so they were responding to different things going on climatically other than temperature potentially. What this also highlights is that in order to have a museum for Illinois to understand our past, we need actually a pretty broad comparative collection. So the specimens that I've got laid out here were all ones that I indicated in the talk, and none of these animals actually occur in the locations where these caves are. However, these caves are relevant to understanding what our ecological past was. And so we need this broad comparative collection in our zoology and comparative collections to actually make sense of Illinois' paleontological past. The next section here is talking about, just really quickly, what are called extirpated species. So these are animals that are still alive today, but have been locally driven to extinction. So they've been removed for various different purposes. So species that were historically present. And so we have a couple of large herbivores that we find remains of in caves. These are some specimens here from cave records in Missouri. We have records of bison. We also have records of elk. And so these are large animals that are not present here currently, and they've disappeared historically. Elk and bison were probably not actively using the caves. They were probably brought in probably by carnivores who were consuming them. Speaking of carnivores, we have evidence of extirpated carnivores as well from these caves. So Mountain lion was historically present in Oregon County, Missouri. We have records of that from this cave. And we also have records of course, wolves. And a lot of these carnivores were driven to extinction just by hunting and persecution from humans. And then another example of an extirpated carnivore that we find in caves is actually a fisher. So this is it's a relative of weasels, the fairly large weasel. And this was an animal that was hunted for its fur and was unfortunately historically driven locally extinct. And of course, this wouldn't be a paleontology talk without me talking about the diverse and charismatic extinct animals that we had in the Midwest. So I really love this quote here. It says, "We live in a zoologically impoverished world from which all the hugest and fiercest and strangest forms have recently disappeared." And so this is a quote from Alfred Russel Wallace, father of zoogeography. He came up with evolution around the same time that Darwin did, but hasn't quite gotten as much credit as Darwin. So these extinct animals that we have from caves in the Midwest. Arguably one of the most charismatic that we have specifically from caves is the short-faced bear. And this is Arctodus. Excuse me. This is actually an example of a really nice fossil that you can see on exhibit. So these bear paws are actually on exhibit in changes in the Illinois State Museum's big exhibits. And this animal was probably living in the cave or denning in the cave. It was using this cave for extended periods of time. So it was using it probably for denning, for birthing offspring, for hibernation, or temporary shelter. And that picture that I showed of the paleontologist doing his work in the cave was actually associated with the excavation of this very large bear. Another example of an animal that we find actually in large numbers in caves are peccaries. So these are flat-headed peccaries. One site in particular, Bat Cave, has at least 73 individuals all found in a particular area in this cave. And we find this animal not just in large numbers within caves, but we also find them in many different caves. And so these animals we think they were using them seasonally for hibernation as shelter, actually going into the cave and staying there for extended periods of time. And these animals were actually subject of recent research by a student who finished up their master's thesis a couple of years ago at Eastern Tennessee State University. And we get enough of these specimens in the caves that you can actually study things like doing age demographic studies. So looking at how many of each age category do we have of the different peccaries. And based on that kind of research, this student actually, this is Aaron Woodruff, he determined that this was a place that peccaries were coming to actually use as a birthing site in the spring. And they were using the cave as a winter shelter following those reproductive seasons. And so this actually is remarkable because we are actually able to get insight into the behavior of an extinct animal. So this is an animal that we can make ecological inferences on what it was doing, even though we'll never be able to observe that animal directly. Another animal that we tend to find, I would say slightly more frequently in caves are giant ground sloths. And so we not only find them in caves, we find several parts of them. So we find fairly complete specimens. I've got some examples here of different parts of a sloth. So over on the left here, we've got a humerus from a Harlan's ground sloth, and that's from Perry County, Missouri. And then on the right, these two images are from a different genus of ground sloths. So we have Megalonyx shown here. The lower image is part of a scapula, so you can kind of see my hand there in the corner, and this is broken off. It's not a complete scapula. And then the object right directly above that is a busted up tooth. from a Jefferson's ground sloth. And so sloths have these really bizarre teeth. They're peg-like, and they don't have enamel on the outside. So your teeth have this really hard material on them called enamel, and sloths do not have that. Another animal that we find in somewhat large abundances and fairly complete skeletons occasionally are dire wolves. And so this is a drawer that I've pulled out from that has material from a cave called Powder Mill Creek Cave. And this animal is found in several different counties throughout Missouri, caves that we have in our collection. And if you haven't checked it out recently, there's some really interesting research on actually how dire wolves are related to modern wolves, and it turns out that they're not actually all that closely related. They're not as closely related as we initially thought. So if anybody has questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. Another large carnivore that we find in caves are Smilodon, and the representation of this animal in our collection is interesting, not just because we have the bones, but it actually turns out because you have these stable environments for extended periods of times, often you can get floors in caves that go undisturbed for thousands of years. And we actually have a footprint from a Smilodon preserved here. This caver was smart enough to shine their light and take a look before they went trampling all over the floor of the cave, and actually found these prints and took a plaster cast of them. Another large cat that we have evidence of from caves in our collection is this animal called Homeetheon. And this is another long canine scimitar-toothed cat, but it is different from Smilodon. This specimen here is actually specifically on exhibit in the Hot Science Gallery right now. So if you wanted to take a look at this up close, you have the opportunity to do that. And then this particular specimen is actually from Minnesota in Fillmore County. We're on a theme here, I guess, large cats. So giant Pleistocene jaguar. So we get this actually up here in the Midwest. We have specimens from, again, Pulaski County in Missouri. And so this is a jaguar that was maybe about 20 to 30% larger than a modern jaguar. It's still not clear if this is a different subspecies of modern jaguar, or if this is just a large version of the same species, as animals for various reasons tend to change bodies, sometimes change body size in response to their environment. Another interesting large animal that we get is the beautiful armadillo. This is an armadillo that was twice the size of modern armadillos. So what I'm showing here in these images, on the left image, this is a portion of the carapace on a modern armadillo, and you can see each of the individual little bone plates. These are called scutes, and you can compare that. This is like a direct comparison. You can compare that to the 2 scutes that I've got set off to the sides here. Interestingly, genetic studies have been done verifying that these are 2 distinct species of armadillo, although closely related. And that study actually did use ISM specimens for that research. We also get camels, or relatives of camels, in the Midwest during the last ice age. And so this is an animal called Heminkenia. I've got a kind of busted up part of a jaw shown here on the left, and a toe bone in hand on the right. And so these are extinct relatives of llamas, vicuñas, and guanacos, which are found in South America. So actually this lineage actually originated in North America and then moved to South America. So camels are from North America. We've also got remains of the giant Stagmose, Cervalsi scotti. We've got 2 different specimens I'm showing here. The one on the left is from Minnesota. And so this is a chunk of an antler. And then the specimen on the right is a portion of a jawbone with teeth intact. So we're getting more into things that probably aren't living in the caves themselves. We have horses that we had several species of horses that were living in the Midwest during the last ice age. Giving you some close-up images here of teeth. So these are teeth on the left. I've got the top one there kind of tilted out so you can see the chewing surface. So you can see sort of the convolutions of the enamel kind of infolding on itself, and that gives this tooth a lot of strength against chewing things like grasses. And then a metapodial bone, or like part of a leg bone, shown here at the top. And then we also, during the last ice age, had this interesting animal. This is a tapir. And these are animals that are, you would find them in South America in forests currently. And I got a close-up picture here of a molar that we've got in a cave from Boone County. And it's also found in Jefferson County in Missouri. We've also got specimens from Kentucky that contain this animal. And if you've never seen a tapir, they're kind of interesting little animals. They have a snout that's reminiscent of an elephant, but shorter. And speaking of trunks, to kind of wrap up here, we do find remains of proboscideans. So these are the elephant relatives within these caves. Now, mastodon and mammoth were probably not living in the caves. These are probably carcasses and pieces of animal that were carried into the cave by carnivores for consumption. And yeah, so on the left we have our mastodon, and this has been found in Lafayette and Perry counties that we have in our collection. And then the mammoth portion of a very weathered tooth here from Perry County, Missouri. So to wrap up, caves, they provide rich records of past life, often in places where fossilization is less likely. So going back to where I was talking about deposition versus erosion, you can get these caves in mountainous environments where you're typically weathering sediments away. So you would not expect to get fossils in those high elevation areas. However, because these are voids within the rocks and you're getting both the sediment going into those openings as well as the animals, this creates a great situation for preserving fossils. They also capture an important record of some less common animals, specifically carnivores. So carnivores are not as abundant sort of in general on the landscape, but when you've got a situation where you've got an environment that's attractive to carnivores, you're increasing the likelihood that they're going to be preserved as a fossil. And so caves are a wonderful opportunity to actually study these animals in more detail. And lastly, caves capture an important record of frequently overlooked small mammals. So the big animals often get a lot of love, but the small animals themselves actually give a lot of information on the environments that are really localized. And as I've indicated with these animals that we're finding in these Midwestern caves that are currently found in far-flung locations in North America, they really give some insight into how different our past was in the Midwest many thousands of years ago. With that, I'm done and I'll take any questions.
So we've had several questions. One is, how old are the fossils?
That's a really good question. And it's not necessarily a straightforward answer. So they're going to be different ages. Different caves might have different deposits that are different ages. As I indicated kind of earlier on, these are going to be things that are less than 2 million, but realistically, we're probably looking at no more than 20,000 years old. And given that some of these are extinct animals, so we're looking at less than 20,000 to 10,000 or 11,000. So in that window, so we're talking tens of thousands of years old.
Another question is, did the last ice age reach the Ozarks?
That's a really good question. No. So this is an area that is, it's got a lot of topographic relief because it hasn't been bulldozed by the large glaciers of the last ice age.
All right. Are the recovered fossils digitally scanned to provide online research?
We're working on that. We have a digital scan of the Homeetheon skull. So the specimen that's on exhibit that I noted, it's kind of the back part of the cranium of that large cat. And we may have a couple of the mastodon teeth scanned, but this is a project that we're currently working on, trying to get these things scanned. So I know we have this tendency to want to scan and provide the very prettiest of specimens, but I can for sure see to it that we scan things that are kind of representative of the research collections as well. Definitely.
Is DNA ever found in the fossils?
Sometimes. So the nice thing about these being younger is that not so much time has gone by that you can't, that the DNA is just completely gone. Unfortunately, cave environments do sometimes tend to be very moist, which can help degrade DNA. But for example, that the beautiful armadillo, the very large armadillo, that was part of an ancient DNA genetic study. So yeah, it is possible to get DNA from these specimens sometimes.
When did the Big Bear Cave become extinct, and what was its estimated life expectancy?
Don't have a good answer on the estimated life expectancy. It went extinct at the end of the last ice age. It went extinct sort of at around roughly the same time that the rest of the megafauna did. So we're looking at probably between like 13 and 11,000 years old. So kind of within that window, very end of the last ice age.
And have any ancient dinosaur fossils ever been found in caves?
Not in the Midwest. I know that this is actually, I have a colleague I can ask. He knows a lot about caves. So what I had alluded to earlier in the talk, that erosion is sort of the enemy of caves. Over time, caves will weather away, either fill in with sediment or get eroded away themselves. And so it's these really old caves are really rare, but I do believe that that my colleague might know of one Mesozoic age cave. So it is possible that there are fossil dinosaurs within that cave.
Another question is, do you ever find small, I'm going to butcher how you pronounce this, extralimital reptiles?
Absolutely. Yes, that's a really good question. So I focus on mammals, and this is a heavily mammal biased talk, apologies. But we do actually find all kinds of material other than mammals. So we find birds, we find amphibians, we find reptiles. One of the things we find a lot of actually in caves are snakes. And I do know that we have in the past, not me, another colleague of mine has found extralimital salamanders. So actually salamanders that were apparently in the past living in a particular location, and now they're elsewhere. So that does tell you something about the environment for sure. Yeah, we find all kinds of things.
All right, we've got another question. In the discussion of animals that were once here but are now found in other places like far west, Canada, and the east, how is it determined that the animals weren't independently or already in those locations at the same time they were here, and the change here was actually an extinction?
That was a long question. Sorry. How do we determine what? Sorry, is it written? Is it in the Q&A or is it in the chat?
It's in the Q&A.
Let me take a look at it. How is it determined that the animals weren't independently? In the discussion, found in other places, how is it determined that the animals weren't? I'm not sure I'm following the question. other places else determine in those other locations. I mean, the evidence we have are the fossils themselves, right? So I will say that at least for, and I hope this answers the question, I will say that at least for the collared lemming, for example, so that was that animal that was living, that today lives much further north, that entire area was covered with an ice sheet. So it's highly unlikely, zero likelihood that that animal, when there was an ice sheet, would be living in that area. And so really the only way it could have gotten there was to have moved north after that ice sheet receded. I mean, we have lots of different fossil sites all over the place with records, and we can kind of start to piece together when certain animals arrive, when certain animals move as a result of environments changing. I mean, that's really the goal with those of us working with this material, is actually determining how animals have shifted and where they were at different times. When did they arrive? When did they leave from certain regions?
All right. So our next question, is there any reason that DNA studies haven't been done on the jaguar? Or is it just about someone finding the funding or having interest?
All of the above. Yeah, so as I noted, it's sometimes the DNA just isn't there. There has to be the funding and the interest. And so it's probably some combination of the two. Also, ancient DNA analyses they're not done by all paleontologists. And so it's finding a colleague who has that interest. It's also technology that's really taken off in like the last decade or so, I'd say. And so what we had prior to ancient DNA was just physical attributes, like what does it look like? And that's still how a lot of these studies of relatedness are done, because ancient DNA is actually, it is fairly expensive.
Any specimens from Injen Joes Cave?
I do not have any information on that. No, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that cave. If it is not part of our collection.
What cave fossil research is currently going on in Illinois?
Good question. One of the reasons that I wanted this position was because the Illinois State Museum actually has a pretty long record of people who've worked here who have an interest in cave paleontology. At the moment, I'm investigating those peccaries that I had noted a little bit further. I'm interested in their diets, potentially what dietary variation there was across age groups. And so I'm looking into that. I also have a colleague who's interested in looking at the small mammals and looking at their teeth and how they potentially have changed over time. So that's some work that's just getting going. Yeah.
All right. How many fossils have you found in one day?
In one day? So it's actually a really fun question. So I haven't done any field work in Illinois. I've done field work elsewhere in the Northern Great Plains, and I worked in a pit cave. So this was just basically, it didn't even look like a cave. It just looked like a dent in the ground. And then we kind of dug down into this, it opened up into like more of a tunnel into a bigger cave. That had a lot of material in it. And so you don't really know what you have until you've like taken the dirt out, screen washed it, and picked through it. But that site had, I mean, I can't even begin to guess how many specimens we have. Thousands, like, of small mammal like teeth and jaws and limb bones and all kinds of stuff. So things that were falling into the pit. I don't know if things were just like running around and didn't see the hole, but they were just like falling into the pit, or if there was actually an animal like using it kind of as a temporary spot to just kind of like eat its lunch. But yeah, probably hundreds, if not thousands.
That's very impressive.
A lot to get through.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
It looks like our next question is maybe a clarifying from one from earlier. Could the animals have existed here and the other places at the same time? Is there dating of fossils in those other areas to only show them being there later?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So that would be, that's how you would do it. I don't know offhand, like if that's been done. But you would need, the unfortunate thing is that there are gaps, right, in the record. So it is entirely possible that something was in a location elsewhere and you're just never going to find it as a fossil. It just didn't get preserved. But yeah, the way that you would actually demonstrate that something was here and here at the same time, in the same way that you would say like these two animals are at the same location at the same time, would be through dating. You'd have to apply some kind of like absolute dating method, like a radiocarbon date. Yeah.
And another question is, how has the spread of white nose syndrome in bats affected your research protocols for field studies in caves? I'm curious about whether you have to do decontamination, et cetera.
Absolutely. It's affected all of our research. There are some caves that are not active bat roosts, and so it's not as big of a concern, but we try to avoid actually going into caves when we know that there are bats actively using it, for lots of reasons. You just don't want to disturb bats. And then the decon procedures, basically making sure that you don't bring something from one cave into another cave that potentially could have those fungal spores on it, and the decon procedure, autoclaving. So high temperature, high pressure, putting it some equipment that can withstand it into those kinds of, basically they're like an oven. And that will kill anything that might be living. And then for things that can just be washed, bleach, thoroughly cleaning, and then also just, making sure that your gear is clean is the biggest thing. I mean, I would go so far to say, like, if you know that you've been somewhere that has white nose, you may want to consider not using that equipment if you cannot thoroughly decontaminate it before you go into another cave situation, because you just don't want, it spreads very easily. You're muted.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the weirdest find in a cave that you've seen, bone or otherwise?
Oh, weirdest find that I've ever found in a cave. Weird. I did see that there was a question about live things. The weirdest, I guess weird, kind of funny, it was more funny. There was a living wood rat in a cave who it was running around with a toe bone, like a pig toe bone in the cave. And it was just like, give it back to us, it's ours. That might be the funniest, like weirdest. I've never seen anything truly weird in a cave.
The next question is, amazing that you can identify so many things. What percentage of fossils remain unidentified? And is there any misidentifications and then corrections that are made?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that I can't put an actual, concrete number on it, so I won't try. Many things cannot be identified as species. They can you can often get something to like within a family or a genus, and then after that it's like, well, this is missing the characteristic that we can actually tell them apart. It's different from having like a complete animal in your hand. So like those skins that I was showing, or a full skeleton, you've got the whole animal, you've got more to work with. And then as far as like the bones and the teeth themselves, which have a lot of diagnostic characters, some animals are just really similar looking, and so you can't necessarily tell them apart. Now there are people that are actively working on using computer algorithms, doing landmark analyses to actually more quantitatively say this is this animal versus this animal. So there are revisions all the time. for sure. So for example, I can give you an example. The colored lemming. The site that I was working at in the Great Plains, for the longest time, all of these colored lemmings that we have south of the ice sheet in all of these caves were being attributed to a species that was really, really far north, like out in Alaska. A colleague of mine was actually able to get ancient DNA out of some specimens from a couple of different caves, and it turns out that it's a different colored lemming species. So the genus was correct, but the species name was incorrect. And so the teeth just didn't have diagnostic enough characters. They actually had to wait until this new technology was available to actually like get the more refined identification on it. And so, yeah, as technology and new methods kind of evolve, there's going to be revisions, absolutely. And it changes your interpretations.
What is your favorite fossil that you've ever found?
Favorite fossil I've ever found? I will say I was really excited when I found my first lemming, but then I found a bunch of lemmings after that, because it was an animal that I had never seen before. It was an animal that didn't live anywhere near me, and they also had really weird looking teeth, like really, really crazy looking teeth. And so so that was really exciting for me. The coolest cave fossil, another cool one, if I had to have a second choice, was a pika. I found a pika jaw. And again, that's an animal that wasn't living anywhere near me. It wasn't in the environment that I was currently working in. So finding something that was so far removed, just like geographically, was really cool. I did find a dire wolf tooth once, but not in a cave.
All right, we've got time for about 2 more questions. Do you target wood rat middens for searches for fossils?
I do not, but my PhD advisor did. So the reason this question I think is being asked is wood rat middens. So wood rats build these little piles basically of sticks and things that they go out and collect and bring it back into their little nest. And then they poop and pee on it. Which sounds really gross, but it turns out in dry, like arid desert environments, that urine, this is so gross, seeps through the midden and hardens. And it actually, you can get wood rat middens that survive for tens of thousands of years, provided that they don't get wet. And so like, yeah, I've never worked in, let's put it this way, I've never worked in an environment that was dry enough for me to actually be, to even think that I would find an ancient wood rat midden. Now out in like the desert Southwest, you're far more likely to find those there, but Northern Plains, not so much, it's a little too wet.
All right, we've got 1 more question.
Mm-hmm.
Any mastodon or human bones found?
No human bones that I'm aware of. Human bones are not something that I want to deal with. If you do find human remains, that changes the entire project. You have to bring in experts who have expertise in human bones. What was the first part of the question?
Mastodon.
Mastodon. I have never found a mastodon in a cave personally, but it does happen occasionally. We've got some caves in our collection that have fragmentary mastodon material. So this is when I say fragmentary, like an isolated tooth or like part of a bone. And so given that it's just little bits and pieces, it's what's likely going on there is a carnivore went out, scavenged something or killed something and brought back a part maybe that tasted really good, and then consumed it in the safety of the cave.
All right, so thank you very much for that great presentation, and thank you everyone for attending the program today.